They called it hysteria, but it was hunger, and not for food, not for affection, for freedom, for space, for power of choice. Freud once stood before the unknown and declared it mysterious. He labeled female desire as absence, as something missing. But listen, absence is not the same as silence, and silence does not mean nothing is there. He said, "What does a woman want?" As if desire was a puzzle, as if the question itself wasn't part of the problem. They looked at women like closed doors, when really, the rooms had no keys, just different architecture. What Freud feared was not confusion, it was independence, a form of wanting that didn't orbit male need. See, when desire isn't predictable, it's dangerous, not to the world but to the systems that claim to control it. Desire is not weakness, it's not waiting, it's movement, it's decision, it's influence that doesn't always ask permission. They said women are ruled by emotion, but emotion, that's data, that's feedback, that's awareness others chose to ignore. History wrote theories about women without asking them. It built cages with scientific language and called the bars biology. But here's the truth, female desire was never missing. It was muted, managed, manipulated. Why? Because if you recognize its power, you can't control it the same way. This isn't just about gender. It's about all who have ever been told their wanting was wrong. Too loud, too strange, too ambitious, too sexual, too direct. Here's the unsettling truth. Desire is not a deficit, it's a direction, and those who embrace it shape culture, shift economies, redefine leadership. So don't wait to be asked what you want. Decide, name it, own it, because mystery is only power wrapped in silence, and the world doesn't fear what it understands, it fears what it can't control, and that is why they called it hysteria, when really it was revolution. They told us desire was something that happens to you, like rain, like luck, like fate, as if it strikes, as if it surprises, as if it belongs to someone else before it belongs to you. But let's make this clear, desire is not passive. Desire is not waiting in a corner, looking pretty, hoping to be noticed. Desire is a weapon sharpened by awareness, polished by patience, and fired by intention. They painted women as responders, receivers, reactors, always following, never leading. But the truth, female desire was never about reacting. It was about selecting. It was about choosing what not to pursue, just as much as what to pursue. What Freud called lack was actually leverage. It wasn't emptiness, it was calculation. Not the absence of wanting, but the presence of strategy. You don't always show your cards when the game begins. You hold, you study. You make them think they understand the rules, then you rewrite them. Desire moves differently when it's denied a voice. It doesn't disappear, it adapts. If you tell a person they're not allowed to want, they don't stop wanting. They learn how to want in silence. They learn how to code it into glances, into gestures, into the space between what's said and what's implied. That's not weakness, that's survival, and survival breeds intelligence. See, the world taught women that to express desire was to risk being punished for it. Called names, shamed, shut down. So what happened? Desire learned to disguise itself in perfection, in caretaking, in beauty, in ambition carefully shaped to not look too threatening. But make no mistake, the engine was still burning, still driving choices, still rewriting expectations. You want to understand power? Watch the person who isn't allowed to speak freely and still manages to shape the outcome. That's desire under pressure. That's strategy born in silence. Freud thought he was looking at confusion, but what he was looking at was control. Quiet control, unspoken control, control that didn't brag because it couldn't afford to. When your desire is criminalized, you learn to make it invisible. But invisible doesn't mean powerless. It means underestimated. And the underestimated always come back stronger. Think of every era where female desire was locked behind doors. Still, it slipped through keyholes. Still, it whispered into art, into letters, into actions disguised as obligation. Desire doesn't die in captivity. It evolves, it watches, learns the structure, learns the system, then flips it, not loudly, but effectively. The myth that desire makes women irrational was a way to keep them from using it. Because once you realize desire isn't weakness, it becomes a tool. not to beg, not to please, but to build, to redirect, to claim. A woman who understands her desire doesn't chase attention, she bends it. She bends time, she bends tradition, not by force, but by presence, and the world doesn't always know how to name that kind of power, so it calls it mystery, it calls it seduction, it calls it everything but what it is: influence. Not loud, not desperate, but deliberate. Desire is not a guest waiting for permission to enter. It is the architect, the one who designs the room before anyone else knows they're standing in it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Desire was never passive. It was planning, watching, choosing, and that's why it was feared, because a desire that chooses for itself can no longer be owned. You call it mystery when you don't want to admit you don't understand it. You label it unknown to excuse not asking the right questions. You label it complex so you never have to confront its clarity. But it's not mystery. It's power that refuses to perform on command. They said feminine energy is elusive. No, it's focused. It's precise, it's just not desperate for your recognition. What you can't predict, you fear. What you fear, you try to control. And when control fails, you rename it enigmatic. Mystery becomes a weapon of dismissal. A polite way to say, we don't get it, so it must be unknowable. But what if the mystery was never about women being confusing? What if it was about them not being decoded by systems that were never built with them in mind? You don't call a locked door mysterious when you know you lost the key. You call it what it is: secured. Society looked at female desire, and instead of asking why it didn't match their blueprint, they declared it broken. Not adaptable, not programmable, too fluid, too intuitive, but that's not dysfunction, that's design. Power that doesn't need to be loud gets called vague. Power that doesn't beg for approval gets labeled detached. They said women were emotionally complicated, but the truth, they were emotionally fluent. They knew when to say nothing because silence speaks louder when people are only trained to listen to noise. They called it mood swings, it was modulation. They called it sensitivity, it was sensory intelligence. And they called that mystery because to name it accurately would mean acknowledging it as power. If you admit the mystery is just misunderstood strength, you lose the right to dismiss it. You lose the excuse to ignore it. Mystery isn't the absence of logic, it's the presence of depth you didn't take time to explore. They said, women are hard to read. No, you just never learned the language. Desire doesn't always move in straight lines. Sometimes it curves, it circles, it watches, it waits. That's not confusion, that's complexity. And complexity is not the enemy of truth, it's the path to it. They wanted women to want simply, cleanly, predictably, but real desire, uncontrolled, unfiltered desire doesn't do clean, it does real. It does raw, it does layered. And when that kind of desire walks into a room, it doesn't have to announce itself. It's felt. Mystery is how power moves when it's not trying to prove itself. And yes, it confuses those who have only known one form of control: visibility. Volume, validation from others, but the kind of power that shapes culture, that steers families, that drives quiet revolutions rarely needs applause. It just needs room. You think she's being mysterious. Maybe she's just not explaining herself to you because she doesn't owe you that. You think she's hard to understand. Maybe she's just precise, and you're used to people simplifying themselves to make you feel comfortable. That's not mystery, that's boundaries, that's self-awareness, and boundaries have always looked threatening to those who only know power as possession. The less you can predict someone, the less you can profit from them. So you brand them mysterious to justify shutting them out, but power doesn't need your permission to exist. It exists anyway, it influences anyway, it reshapes anyway, because misunderstood power is still power. And over time it becomes undeniable. The mystery was never in her. It was in your refusal to see her clearly. What they called mystery was really autonomy, was really discernment, was really a refusal to be decoded by tools too blunt for her depth. And when mystery becomes clarity, the system shifts, the roles invert, the questions change, and suddenly those who once asked, "What do women want?" realize the question was never hers to answer, it was theirs to rethink. You don't fear what you understand, you only fear what you can't control, and control slips when influence becomes invisible. That's the danger of desire. It doesn't always announce itself. It moves underneath. It doesn't ask to lead, but it makes people follow. They tried to study female desire like a map, like it had fixed borders, like it obeyed coordinates, but desire isn't a place, it's pressure, it's gravity. It's the thing that pulls without force, without shouting, without needing a reason. What they couldn't measure, they couldn't master, so they reduced it to body, to hormone, to myth, but they missed the pattern. They missed the precision, they missed the truth. Desire is not chaos, it's intelligence, and intelligence, when you don't expect it, looks like rebellion. When a woman wants, she builds the conditions for it. She doesn't wait for permission, she alters her environment, subtly, strategically, not to dominate but to decide, because real influence is not about power over people, it's about direction through people. They think influence is leadership, but leadership is often loud. Influence doesn't need volume, it just needs presence. She changes the mood of the room by walking in without saying a word. That's not charm. That's authority wrapped in desire. You feel her want before she names it, because it's not performative, it's embodied, and that's why they call it dangerous, because it's not controlled by fear, it's fueled by clarity. Influence begins where certainty lives, and desire, when owned, becomes certainty in motion. The woman who knows what she wants doesn't need to explain herself. She just is, and everyone adjusts. Schedules change. Plans bend, even resistance reorganizes itself in response to her gravity. That's how influence works, not with commands, with currents. Desire that isn't forced is followed, because people don't move for logic. They move for energy, and desire is energy that knows its destination before it even begins. Freud never saw this, because he looked at women as puzzles instead of as players. He asked, what do they want? But never asked, what does their wanting shape? Because if he did, he'd have to admit that female desire isn't just personal, it's structural, it drives how relationships work, it defines how families form, it influences trends, it predicts behavior. It shifts economies, and you want to ignore it. Good luck, because every system built to overlook it still bends toward it, silently, daily, reluctantly. They said it was unpredictable, but the only thing unpredictable was the fact that it didn't want to be predicted. Because when desire is predictable, it can be packaged, and when it's packaged, it can be sold, manipulated, marketed. But when it's real, raw, refined only by experience, not expectation, it cannot be captured. Only felt, only followed. That's why desire isn't about attraction. It's about influence, and influence is what reshapes the world without asking for permission. So if you want to understand how power actually moves, stop looking at who's speaking the loudest. Start looking at who doesn't need to speak at all. If you want to understand desire, stop asking what is wanted. Start asking why the world changes every time she steps fully into it. That's not mystery. That's mastery, and once you see it, you realize it was never about understanding her. It was about respecting what she already understood. They didn't erase the power. They just never wrote it down. She influenced dynasties, but they recorded the king. She raised nations, but they named the fathers. She led revolutions through whispers, through decisions made behind closed doors, but the books said nothing happened until a man raised his voice. That wasn't oversight, that was strategy, because if you name the power, you have to honor it, and if you honor it, you lose your monopoly over the story. History wasn't written in facts, it was written in fear. Fear of what would happen if people saw where the real control lived, not always on thrones, not always on stages, sometimes in kitchens, sometimes in bedrooms, sometimes in silence. Power didn't always dress like authority. Sometimes it dressed like patience. Sometimes it dressed like waiting, but that wait was never passive. It was watching. It was tracking. It was reading the room before the room knew it was being read. And when the moment came, it moved, quick, clean, sharp. They said women were behind the scenes. No, they were the scene. They set it. They lit it. They changed the script, while others still thought they were in charge of the play. But history doesn't reward subtlety. It rewards spectacle. So when a woman shaped the course quietly, they called it coincidence. They called it intuition. They called it luck. because if you called it strategy, you had to admit she knew exactly what she was doing. And they couldn't allow that, because if she knew, she wasn't just surviving, she was competing, she was calculating, she was winning. They feared the idea that a woman's silence wasn't submission, it was surveillance. Because silence used right is sharper than any sword, and every time she spoke up she was punished, labeled difficult, emotional, unstable, too much, so she adapted. She mastered the art of being underestimated. And that's the most dangerous form of power, the kind no one sees coming. They didn't burn every book. They just never wrote her into them. They didn't lock every door. They just convinced her the key didn't exist. But it did. It always did. And many times she was the key. Power didn't vanish. It was buried, under obedience, under roles, under silence. But silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of listening. She listened, she learned, she adapted to a world that only valued her when she disappeared. So she disappeared on the surface, but underneath, she built empires. She passed knowledge in coded language. She protected what they tried to steal. She remembered what they tried to erase. And now, the silence echoes, louder than noise, because history is full of gaps, and every gap is a woman's name written in invisible ink. To understand power, you have to read what isn't written. You have to hear what wasn't said out loud, because the absence of her name was never the absence of her impact. It was design. It was erasure by intention. Because if the world had seen her clearly, it would have had to rebuild itself, and maybe that's what this all leads to, not just seeing her, but naming her, not just hearing her, but understanding she was always speaking. Through culture, through resistance, through desire, through influence, they tried to bury her power in silence, but silence keeps records, and now the record is breaking open.